Talk about how the creation of Spider-Man led to the creation of Mr. A and the Question, which would lead Alan Moore to create Rorschach, which was a critique of the ideas at play there, which would ultimately end up with Zack Snyder fundamentally misunderstanding Rorschach. In 1962, Stan Lee understood there was a growing demand among teenagers for comics. He went to Martin Goodman, who was the publisher for Marvel, and pitched an idea for a new character. Goodman wasn't really sold on the ideas presented, but Spider-Man got a tryout in Amazing Fantasy 15. Official creators of Spider-Man are Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. There was some controversy with Jack Kirby saying it was based on this idea, the Silver Spider he had come up with in the 50s with Joe Simon. In 1971, Kirby would essentially give credit to Steve Ditko, saying it was his character, and Stan Lee would credit him as a co-creator eventually as well. Publisher Goodman would eventually see the sales numbers for Amazing Fantasy 15. They were very good, so we got the Amazing Spider-Man. Off in March of 1963, and for the purpose of this video, I want to give you guys a look inside that first issue. This is what we are first presented with about Spider-Man. Now, Ditko wasn't sure that Lee would like the idea of him being under a mask, but Ditko saw him as a young character, felt this was necessary for people to take him seriously. Also, there was the idea that this could be anybody under that. Eventually, Lee would really want to lean into the everyman ideas here, while I think Ditko perhaps viewed the mask as a way to create a more isolated hero here, which we would see again later on with his heroes, Mr. A and the Question. Question and Mr. A would not come for another 4 or 5 years, but it brings us into the meat of the conversation, because when you think about the philosophical ideas that many people thought Ditko was always kind of mulling over, it really is the philosophy of Ayn Rand. She was a staunch capitalist who hated religion. She was the mind behind the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. Her big idea was Objectivism, which had a lot to it, but to put it simply, quote, the concept of a man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. She was concerned with individualism. She said there is good, there is evil. She was not a big fan of altruism, or really doing anything else for the primary purpose of helping others. It all comes down to what is good for you and the individual. A lot of these ideas Rand was dealing with really are pivotal to Spider-Man. We see a lot of this stuff even throughout all the films. A lot of times we see questions about what is actually good for Peter Parker. What does Spider-Man mean? What's good for the community? Why does he do the things that he does? What people like to say is that Steve Ditko was a big fan of Ayn Rand. He was ruining the character, or he would have ruined the character eventually, making him this bitter, selfish asshole. The thing is, when you think about it, it was Stan Lee himself putting Steve on to Objectivism, which I think makes sense when you think about the process here, and when you look at this run of Amazing Spider-Man 1 through 38, which is when Ditko walked away. As this run continued, a rift would develop between Ditko and Stan Lee. Ditko himself has talked about this at length. If you want to understand why that happened, it seemed like there was a breakdown of communications. These two simply stopped speaking to each other. I think there was also some tension with Ditko only being viewed as the artist, right, and not as important. But starting with Amazing Spider-Man 25, he was actually plotting the stories. He was coming up with the general ideas, then he was doing the actual artwork, and then it was Lee coming in to do the script. It makes the conversation interesting when you think about the influence of Rand on these early comics. People put that on Ditko, but it's actually Stan Lee that was writing the dialogue. I think it's really interesting because on one hand, Spider-Man is young. You're kind of watching him grow up and learn lessons here. He's not supposed to be perfect, but on the other hand, in the very beginning, he basically goes to the Fantastic Four and wants to work for them, but he wants money from it. He basically wants to be used as a mercenary. Primary motivation there seems to be not altruistic, but he is thinking of himself as a Randian character might. The interesting thing with Rand's characters is that they are bastions of individuality, and you see that even when he does start working with the Fantastic Four later on, it does not really go well. He's not a team player. They don't really like him. Nobody really likes him. It's where he's trying to work with Johnny Storm, and they really just kind of end up getting in each other's way, and the criminal is caught by the police. One of the most iconic moments from this run is this sort of Atlas-esque moment, right, with Peter lifting all of this rubble off of himself. He does this on his own. Peter is also doing things oftentimes with others in mind. I don't think the Objectivism really is fully there yet from Ditko or Lee. I think Lee perhaps found those ideas interesting, but always wanted to kind of lean more towards the left, more towards something that was safe and palatable. He wanted to sell comics. I think one of the most interesting characters when it comes to Rand reading these early comics is J. Jonah Jameson. Like I showed you guys here, I think this stuff makes a whole lot of sense. See, Rand was not a big fan of the press, was not a big fan, allegedly, right, of the opinions of the many, was not a big fan of the unwashed masses. The thing with Spider-Man is, right, the press and the people have to constantly be doubting him or putting pressure on him or shit-talking him, and here we basically get the truth that J. Jonah Jameson envies him. Say, as you move through these issues in 36 towards the end of Ditko's run, you start to get some more warning signs here. We have a villain called the Looter, which is a term directly from Rand, but again, who really knows whose idea this was in terms of the name? Could it have been Lee or Ditko. Famously in 38, which was the last comic Ditko was responsible for, you have Peter basically brushing off protesters. This is, I believe, in 1966 when sentiment towards the Vietnam War was not good. Also, Peter Parker and Spider-Man were incredibly popular. People loved them, but it seems like almost the more that people loved them, the more Ditko resented them. People seem to like to put a lot of that onto Ditko himself, but 30 issues later, Peter has an arguably far weirder exchange with protesters. Black student protesters speaking out against the dean, and Peter saying, well, that's your side of the story. What does the dean say? Eventually, Flash Thompson will be sent off to Vietnam. Not much commentary provided there. It's all kind of rah-rah gung-ho. But I have to say, I think a lot of the really interesting stuff can be tied to the relationship between Jonah Jameson and Peter Parker. I think that Ditko saw a lot of similarities there between himself and Stan Lee. Perhaps between himself and the publisher Goodman, who no matter how well his comics were doing, always seemed to be breathing down his neck and micromanaging. You get this idea of Peter Parker, the freelancer, just like Ditko, being exploited by his boss. So Spider-Man was going to be getting the original animated series, which was going to be animating the work of Ditko, for which he was not going to get any money. So everything Spider-Man was being licensed, which Ditko was not getting a piece of either, despite the fact that he was the artist and he was also plotting out a lot of the stories. Also, as the character got more popular, they got more and more responses from fans. They got more and more nitpicking. They got more comic book fans expressing themselves very vocally, which seemed to piss off Ditko. When you look at his writings, he did not like his own fans. It seems that while Lee and fans liked Peter Parker as a more clean-cut hero, Ditko wanted him to be a little bit edgier, a little bit harsher, a little bit meaner, a little bit more selfish. Stan Lee himself said, Ditko thinks he's the genius of the world. We were arguing so much over plot lines. I told him to start making up his own stories. He won't let anyone else ink his drawings either. You can see the growing contempt that Ditko felt, his growing objectivism build in the comics. I think you can also see that contempt reflected in the way that the world treats and views Spider-Man. I think Peter Parker's financial troubles and concerns are reflected from Ditko. Ditko was also the co-creator of another cold, callous, bitter, and somewhat isolated hero in Stephen Strange, Doctor Strange, but that's a topic for another video. But eventually Ditko, with all these factors, would walk away from Spider-Man. He'd make his way back to Charlton Comics. As I said, he was a freelancer at Charlton. They wouldn't be able to pay him as much, but he would have creative freedom. He'd be able to make the stuff he wanted to make. At this point, he seems to have fully gone off the deep end into objectivism. Work on Captain Atom, who he co-created, Blue Beetle. He'd work on Mr. A, who he created, and also The Question. The Question was the official Charlton version of Mr. A. Mr. A was published independently. Basically, there was no comics code authority, so he could do whatever he wanted with that character, make him as violent as he wanted. Question would be acquired by DC in 1983, but before that, it was all Ditko's, and the character was used to just kind of vomit the philosophy of Ayn Rand. With this character, he's exceptionally violent. He sees everything in black and white, obviously very subtle here. Good and evil, that's on his card. He also is not wearing the blank mask, but he's wearing a mask that has a blank face on it. Like The Question, he is a reporter and a crime fighter as well. In the 80s, Alan Moore comes along and he makes Watchmen, and he's tackling a lot of Ditko's characters, but Ditko is someone that he couldn't disagree with more politically and philosophically, but he still respected. The Question was Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, and Captain Atom were obviously equivalent. Night Owl and the new Blue Beetle, well, the Ted Kord Blue Beetle were equivalent. I think it's really interesting that Steve Ditko came up in the industry under Jerry Robinson, who was a Batman artist. I think there are big shades of Batman in both Night Owl and Rorschach. Alan Moore rather famously hated the works of Ayn Rand. He said he had to look at the fountainhead. He said he found her philosophy laughable, saying there were shades of white supremacy. And he said that people who liked her ideas believed themselves to be part of the elite and kind of above everyone else. Talking about The Question, he talked about Steve Ditko having a political agenda that was very different from his, but kind of respecting him for having a political agenda and being willing to put that into his work. Going on to say, despite the fact that Steve Ditko was obviously a hero to the hippies with his psychedelic Doctor Strange work, and for the teen angst of Spider-Man, his politics were obviously very different from those fans. He had a very right-wing agenda, but at the time it was quite interesting, and that probably led to me portraying Rorschach as an extremely right-wing character. I think Rorschach is essentially Alan Moore satirizing The Question and making fun of this stuff. I think there is a hint of respect there in the way this guy is so steadfast in his ideals, much like Ditko was. And of course, when it's all said and done, Zack Snyder says, wow, Rorschach is really cool.